And good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for May. Oh my gosh, it's already May. May 28th. It's the May CAI webinar. We're glad to have you here this morning. Hope your long week was your long weekend, excuse me, was a comfortable one, and one you're able to maybe recharge or refresh, or maybe just catch up a little bit from whatever you're doing. I'm really happy to have our state's resident expert on apprenticeship and my colleague Vince Kohler with us here today to talk a bit about youth apprenticeship and its general spread in the U.S. Now, we've been able to have lots of conversations between cohort calls, between different webinars and other settings between CAI grantees about apprenticeship in general, good policies, good practices, good strategies for developing, advancing, and working within our own programs. And this month, we're going to have an opportunity to really kind of take a step back, look at the world of apprenticeship, not just here in California, but also a little bit outside of California as well. Because while we know quite a whole lot and do a lot of great work here, we know we don't know everything. And fortunately, we have Vince, who does keep an eye out for things that are happening not just here in California, but also across the country and even internationally. Our hope is that this conversation will not only generate some ideas and some interest from your part, maybe some thoughts about how you might affect the work that you're doing and think about how it applies into a bigger policy and systems lens for your programs, but it also might generate some questions or some ideas that get you thinking and reaching out or tapping resources that you have or connecting with some of your peers as we all work together to build not just great apprenticeship programs, but systems level apprenticeships here in California. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I think most folks are pretty familiar, but we do have the chat box up here. Matter of fact, I'm going to type into it just a second. Good morning. Feel free to drop questions along the way that you have here. It's one mechanism that we have. We'll keep an eye out for what's going on in the chat box. As questions come up, certainly feel free. If you don't want to interrupt, feel free to drop it in there. You can also save your questions. We'll have an opportunity to open up the floor and chat with folks towards the end of the presentation as well. So you can do either one of those avenues, and we'll just keep an eye out for it. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Vince to lead us in this great discussion. Hi, Vince. Morning.
Good morning, Caleb, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. Nothing like starting a week after a long weekend talking about youth apprenticeship, one of certainly my favorite topics. And I thought, I'll take you through a little bit of a journey that includes some examples from around the world. And it is addressing the question of why youth apprenticeship is spreading in the US, not just the why, but also maybe the why now and the benefits, and certainly the potential for grantees like yourselves, both now and in the future. So I'll want to set the context a little bit. My background, I've been working on workforce issues for 20 years with SPR. Before that was a practitioner in the workforce system as well. And I do have sort of a connection to youth apprenticeship in particular because of where I came from when I came to the US, which is Switzerland. And Switzerland is still sort of seen as an interesting model for youth apprenticeship in particular, that a number of US models are based on that are currently sort of in the development stages, in various levels of development stages. I'm going to see if I can make the slides here work for me. All right. So I wrote a paper late last year together with JFF and some other friends who participated. I want to mention them. Obviously, the Foundation for California Community Colleges, we've been partnering with them on providing technical assistance support for the CAI initiative, and been partnering in other ways. Also relevant, as I said, JFF, their National Center for Work-Based Learning and Apprenticeship, and New America with their new initiative, the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship. And as an additional partner for us has been ETH Zurich. That's sort of the MIT of Switzerland, a school that has an institute that studies career education around the world, and has been a hub for this effort globally. They do a summer institute just about coming up, and California has been sending delegations. Last year, I participated in one of them, another delegations head there. So we've been sharing their research. Some of the research that I'll show you is from ETH, from our friends there. And I think that's been useful in part because in some ways California has an advantage as a global economic power, but also means that in some ways we need to measure ourselves against other global powers, maybe more so than other states in the union, because it's not as easy sometimes to find comparisons within the US. But globally, you know, Singapore and Japan and Germany and other countries that are evolving their training systems as their economies are evolving are good models to just at least look at and see, are we on the right track? So why apprenticeship and why youth apprenticeship in particular? This graph shows you sort of what's been happening over the last 50 years in terms of maybe most dramatically the red line, which shows how easy it is for someone to get a job with minimal education. In the 50s, you could get a job. More than 80% of people could get a job with minimal education. That basically means a high school diploma or equivalent. In 2014, this is the latest data we have, but you can imagine that this trend line continues, that right now, fewer than 10% can get a job anymore with minimal education. So this is a pretty dramatic decline or increase in educational requirements. The other lines that are interesting here, the ones that head upwards, are interestingly the experience line. So the need to have experience when you look for work has gone up from just above 10% in the 50s to now near, somewhere between 70 and 80%. And of course, the question is always, if you require experience to get work, then to get a job, then how do you get that experience if you haven't had a job? And so the people that we're working with often have that experience, and they're sort of in this dilemma, which is why we have a situation where in a full employment, near full employment economy, we still have a very large number of people that are actually struggling to make it in this market. The other line I want to highlight that's interesting, that's gone up since the 50s, is this, I don't know if we want to call that orange, it depends how your screen displays it. It's called soft skills, also sometimes called 21st century skills, employability skills. Not sure soft skills actually describes them very well. This is, your ability to communicate, to work in teams, all those things that employers say that the people they're looking for sometimes don't have, or they're very much looking for. And it turns out they're looking for them, and more than almost three quarters of all jobs require those soft skills. And again, that didn't used to be that way. Employers used to think that they basically either trained them on the job for those soft skills, or maybe, this is not shown by this research, maybe they just thought the candidates already had those soft skills, so that was not necessary. So anyway, this is the context within which we see ourselves. So clearly, experience required post-secondary education required and soft skills at a premium. Now we have another contextual factor that's interesting and challenging. We often hear about the skills gap, which supposedly describes that, employers are looking for skills that they're not finding among those looking for work. I think there's some problems with the way we look at the skills gap, but there's no doubt that there is a degree gap. And the degree gap is described in the difference between the people who currently have a job and what level of education they have, and those that are advertised, those positions that are advertised in that same classification. So here's an example of a supervisor of production worker currently employed in this position. Only 16% have a degree, but the job postings for that same type of job, 67% of people looking for work, 67% of postings require a degree. And that's a stunning gap in terms of what employers are saying currently. The people who are doing those jobs, assuming that they're not messing up, what level of requirement they have compared to what they're looking for. And the degree gap is actually creating another problem for people looking for work, especially those who don't have a degree. And that is, of course, you need experience, you need soft skills. Apparently you need a degree for many positions that are sort of mid-level. And yet, so if you don't have 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3 even, you might not make it. And the question is, why are employers using degrees as a way to, filter? And the answer, there are different answers from different employers, but one of the answers is it's the filter they have, and they're going to use it because they don't want to talk to thousands of candidates, even if it's not the best filter. And many employers say, this is not a good predictor of success, but I need to use something, so I'm going to use degree. And degree shows that you've actually, had some stick-to-itiveness, you've actually, done something and completed it. So that's going to be a measure of success. So the question is, are there better ways and more, ways that are attached to the work itself that would be better predictors of success in a job? And, so that's one question. The other question is, if that's true, if we require degrees or employers require degrees, then how are we doing in getting young people those degrees? And it turns out we're not doing great, I would say. So this is a statistic that's a few years old. It gets updated every so often, but it hasn't changed much. And it shows what happens to 100 ninth graders some years after they are in 9th grade. So the drop-off rate is that 3/4 of those 9th graders will make it and will graduate from high school. A little less than half start college. About 30% stay enrolled a year later. Only 1 in 5 earn a degree, or roughly 1 in 5 within 6 years. And only about 12%, 12 out of 100, earn a 4-year degree. So again, if we say college for everyone, employers say we want college, by that measure, we're not doing great in preparing young people for that. So the question is there something we could be doing for the, anywhere from, let's say 3/4 to, 60 to 75% of young people that are not making it to a degree, or a 4-year, certainly not a 4-year degree. And that is the question. Is there something we can do that gets us there without a degree, or gets us to a degree in a different way? And one of the questions, of course, is what do we think is the best way to gain work experience, since that's a requirement, and the employability skills. So let's leave the degree aside for a moment. How do we best gain those skills? I should ask the question here. You can put it in the chat if you want. What do you think is the best way to gain employability skills? And the answer is, as you might have guessed, it's really on the job, right? I mean, it's clear that the best place to learn what a job needs you to have, what's the work experience and the employability skills are obviously best gained on the job. We had a project with the US Department of Education where they asked us to study this question. And we spent a year, we told them at the beginning of the year, we actually kind of have the answer. There's a lot of studies that have been done, but we'll study it for you. The answer that came back was the answer that we kind of knew at the outset, which is, it's of course on the job. That is the place to gain those skills. And it turns out a number of companies, including some of the biggies in the Bay Area, Google and Apple, have said, we no longer require degrees to work for us. We are understanding that a degree is not actually the best predictor. You know, just look at Steve Jobs. The degree, completing your degree is not necessarily the best predictor. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It's a very good idea to do it, but it is not the only way to get there. There's also some evidence from some studies that have been done in the US by our partners at ETH in Colorado, where those skills are best learned. They asked employers, and employers basically said, of the skills that we want, from left to right, you'll see whether they're best acquired in school or work, and from top to bottom, you see the importance of the skill. So it turns out, apparently advanced math was not that important. Health and safety wasn't even that important. That was a little bit of a surprise. Trustworthiness, reliability, motivation, commitment, those are all very important to employers. And if you look at this graphic, you'll see that basically on the purple side, or is this lilac, you see that the majority of those skills that employers think both are important, and even some of them are not that important, the vast majority of those skills are learned on the job. The only thing that employers in Colorado said they thought school is the place to learn them are communication skills and advanced math skills. Everything else, including, things like problem solving, efficiency, basically all the soft skills are showing up on the work side. So this argues, and this is something you all know as practitioners in apprenticeship, this argues for the fact that work-based education, having employers be producers of talent and not just consumer of talents, makes the most sense, because asking schools to train on this is maybe not the best way to advance the skill set of the people that are looking for work or that are in training currently. So we have a interesting situation that I think also calls for youth apprenticeship as a solution. If we say work-based learning or being on the job is necessary for those skills to be acquired that employers want. And we find that in California, for example, we have youth disconnection at a fairly alarming rate. It's not actually much higher than elsewhere in the country, but still 500,000 youth. These are young people that are not in education and are not in employment between 16 and 24. 500,000 young people basically disconnected from either of those paths. And so those young people are obviously looking for ways to connect. And the question is, how are we going to connect them? And also looking into the future, how are we going to prevent people from disconnecting, young people from disconnecting, dropping out of school? What is it that would keep them in school? And of course, one interesting fact and data point when you look and when you try to unpack this 500,000 out of school or opportunity youth is, if you look at, this is data from the Measure of America, which does this based on both census data and other data sources. What you find is that of those 500,000, a very large factor in their not being connected is that they have no high school diploma or no further education. Again, this is the exact match to what we said before, which is high school diploma and further education is a necessary prerequisite for being successful in the workplace. So it gets a little bit circular, but really the idea is we have to connect these young people to something that keeps them connected to the workplace or gets them into the workplace, which actually may help them with their education. And this is where youth apprenticeship comes in, because research shows, and this is especially apparent in countries where this is widespread, that having this alternative to the standard high school education actually increases post-secondary education success rates. It's not that this is an alternative to college so much as that it is an alternative to college and through college, that you actually end up with a post-secondary education that's equivalent to a college education. And in many cases later, go to advanced degrees. And the reason you do that through a youth apprenticeship is that something happened when you learn to apply your skills at an earlier age, 16, 17, 18, that unlocked something that made learning more meaningful. All of you who are in work-based learning programs or have ever worked on them do see that happening with young people, that as soon as they see their talents applied and they understand, oh, this is why math matters, then education becomes more meaningful. So this is one main reason why youth apprenticeship makes so much sense as a way to actually not, again, be an alternative to a college education, but more another approach into a college equivalent education, perhaps that may include college. There's another reason why youth apprenticeship makes sense and is different from, say, an adult apprenticeship, and not that adult apprenticeships don't make a ton of sense, they do, and obviously we have a healthy adult apprenticeship system in California already with more than 80,000 adult apprentices, especially in the trades. The average age of an apprentice in California is about 29 years old. And of course, at 29, you have certain requirements. You may have a family, you may have a house, if you're lucky, and you have costs that require that you be paid a certain amount that makes your apprenticeship wage in order for you to make a living, fairly costly for an employer. When you're 16, 17, 18, that's a little different. You may still be living at home, and your cost as an apprentice would be lower. And that has a number of benefits. Here's a way in which apprenticeships in countries that do this on a wider scale than we do for young people are profitable. And when I say profitable, I don't mean that they're profitable by paying off for society or even the employer in the future, but that they pay off during the program itself. And some of you may have seen this graph before. Certainly if you've heard my lecture about it, then you've seen this before. It comes from Dr. Katie Caves from the ETH. It's based on Bob Lerman data. And it basically shows that as training costs increase during an apprenticeship program, the return on that investment also increases, and it increases more rapidly than the training costs increase. So the reason training costs go up during an apprenticeship, generally speaking, is that wages actually increase. Usually they are progressively higher. A typical wage of a youth apprentice in say, a European country, Germany, Austria, Switzerland are good examples for this, are around $1,000 in the first year, maybe $1,500 in the second, and $2,000 in the third. So these are very low wages compared to a journey person's wage in those countries. but they're pretty high compared to going to school. So it's a well-paid education, not a low-paid job, is what most people would argue. But training costs go up in part because the wages go up. They go up in stages. It's not linear, as this graph makes it appear. But they also go up because the training costs themselves go up. The cost to the company, they tend to have higher skilled, higher, more costly employees do the training as the training program progresses. They may get access to costlier machinery. So overall, the training costs do go up over time. In the very beginning of the person's apprenticeship, they produce very little of work that is actually, pays for itself. So there are no widgets being produced. There are very few customers being seen. So until about the midpoint of the program, there's very little that there's not enough for the company to break even. Somewhere in the middle, the idea is they do break even. So that apprentice produces enough widgets at enough quality that they're kind of breaking even with the cost of that training, which again is still relatively low compared to a journey person's wage. And in the second half of the training, the idea is they actually produce more than they cost, quite a bit more. And the important thing is that the return period is actually, covers the investment period and then a little bit more. On average, say, if you just take the average of all apprenticeships in Switzerland, for example, youth apprenticeships, the return on investment for employers is about 10%. That's not bad. That beats the stock market. And it's important that this be positive. You may think, why should they be profiting on training young people? The benefit of having that happen is that you're not as worried about having somebody poach your employee if you're actually getting a return on an employee during the training period. And it turns out in a system that has full employment and full sort of saturation with apprenticeships, only a third of the employers need to train for this to work. But they do need to make some money. Not every single business needs to make money during training. There are some specialized occupations where you can't really make money during the training period. Like a watchmaker or a goldsmith probably doesn't make a profit during the training period at all. But others make quite a bit of profit. And some businesses are wholly reliant on having a stable of apprentices in their midst. So that's kind of key to making to that return on investment. So if you talk to an employer, showing them this graph is kind of key as a way to sell them on the idea that this is a good idea. Now, why do apprentices like it? Well, I think when we talk to apprentices, this is true here and elsewhere. I'm sure you have had this experience. It changes their outlook on education, actually, and on life. So when we hear from young apprentices in particular, I listened to a panel of Aeroflex participants from Southern California last year, and they were talking about how in the first year they had a different outlook on life. They understood why education mattered. This one young man said, he realized that 99% on a test is not good enough, when you're building airplanes. He always thought it was good enough in school, but when you build airplanes, 99% is obviously not good enough. So it really adds meaning to education in general. It also is, attractive because you are making money and you're not incurring debt. So those are pretty significant ways in which you have a positive return. I remember this when I went to school. I did the academic track. My buddies were making more money than I did at a young age, at 17 or so. They had motorcycles. I was still on my bicycle. And that was sort of an immediate signal to me, well, maybe, this academic path may pay off someday, but it sure isn't paying off right now in the same way in ways that matter to a teenager. So employers like it, and this is no different from what I'm sure, experiencing with other, with the apprenticeship programs that you're currently running. it is a way to produce the talent that actually is tailor-made for your organization. So that's positive. It also, especially with young people, adds to innovation in your company. There are certainly companies that basically say, without the kind of innovation that comes from young people that come into our company every year, and on average, a training company in Europe has anywhere from 10 to 15 to even 20% of their overall roster are apprentices. So that really changes the dynamic in the workplace, and older employees, people who've been there for a while, constantly sort of have to argue for the way they do things, and that has a positive effect on innovation. The retention and sort of productivity side seems sort of intuitively to make sense. Just give you an example. Here's a somewhat more traditional apprenticeship. This is a cabinet maker, carpenter shop. This rather young owner of this shop has 16 employees. 4 of them are apprentices. Here are the 4 that came this last year. These are the 4. They look very young. They are very young, and they're sort of the new crop. In this case, they just started their apprenticeship. And it gives you an idea. So they got signed on, they got their T-shirt, and they are going to be in that shop for 3 years building things and learning how to be a carpenter. And for the business, that's important. It's a role they play in the community, but it's also something that makes their business more profitable overall. So this is not altruism. This is not charity. This is actual business sense. I think one thing that we find when we look around the world for ways in which these systems work, and this sort of gets into the nitty-gritty, is that simplicity can help sell an employer on the idea. You've probably sometimes talked to employers and they've said, hey, this is a little complicated. I don't know how to get started. You played a role in helping it facilitate. One thing we find, and this is no different for youth or adult apprenticeships, is that if we keep it simple, it helps. This is a 2-page contract as an example of, I think this was the one that was in use in this shop that I just showed you. This is what the employer, the parent, and the youth sign. It spells out the length, the content, not the detailed content, obviously, it's the type of apprenticeship it is. Times, holidays, times of working hours, and so forth. It's all spelled out, 2 pages, everybody signs it, and you get started. So it's a pretty simple process. Obviously, what happens behind the scenes in terms of setting that up is a little more complicated, but keeping it simple so that employers get the meaning clearly, the student, the participant, the apprentice gets it clearly, that makes it easier for everyone to sign on. So let's take a look at how these systems can compare. So California, I mentioned, has roughly between 80 and 90,000 apprentices. Still very, very strong dominance in the building trades. 80% or so are in the building trades, firefighters, correctional occupations. And then the others are, fewer than 10% of all the other occupations. And so this is where the growth is occurring. Obviously, if we get to 126,000, which was the Governor Brown's goal, or certainly if we get to 500,000, clearly this means broadening to all sorts of other occupations. And it does mean, essentially necessarily means, that we add youth apprenticeships to the mix. Just as an example, again, I'm drawing on Switzerland a little bit because it is a good sort of microcosm. It's about 1/4 of the economy of California. In 2016, this is sort of the breakdown. I didn't do a bubble chart of this, but it gives you an idea of where the majority of apprenticeships are. And they are in different fields from what we have here in California. So commercial employees are essentially anyone who is working in an insurance, in a bank, in a commercial enterprise, let's say an account rep or an accountant, we would probably send young people to get a business degree at a community college or at a four-year school, and then they are ready to be what is generally termed to as a commercial employee. By far the largest group of occupations. And again, they share some basic schooling together, and then they get specialized in their occupations because they go to a bank or they go to an insurance agency or they go, into a government business, a government agency to run the books, for example. And then you see retail, healthcare, social work, electrician, so forth. So you basically have an idea of how this shakes out if you have a system that is sort of at full employment with apprentices. 75% of young people in high school choose the apprenticeship path over just a purely academic path. So this really is a way into employment for many, many young people. Now, this is we started the talk by saying that why is it taking a hold in the U.S. Part of the reason is it makes sense, and it is a debt-free way to get into college, or at least the educational debt should be minimized to get someone into college. This is Trident Technical College in South Carolina. The signing day, if you go and Google that YouTube video, you'll see a very motivational video with excited young people signing their contracts. These guys are signing up, and there were certainly women there as well, although this picture doesn't show it, signed up with Bosch, a German automaker and auto parts manufacturer in South Carolina, which started a youth apprenticeship program. There's, I don't know, a thousand young people looking for positions and having kind of a job fair type atmosphere here, and then signing on with an employer or another based on their preference. So this happens. These young people go into a program that looks a bit like this. They go into high school in year one. There are 3 days in high school, 2 days on the job. In year two, this is the 12th grade. So they start in 11th grade. In 12th grade, year two of their apprenticeship, they go to high school for 2 days. So this is their senior year. They're still with their cohort in high school, but they're on the job for 3 days. And they are at some specialized training center for 1 day per month. And then they graduate. And interestingly enough, they graduate with about 20 to 30 community college or college credits. And a year later, they go to college as well for the third year. So this is after high school. This is at this Trident Community College or Technical College. And now they're on the job most of the time. And they do some college classes, still do their training center hours. And a year later, they graduate with an associate degree. So they have an associate, they have a high school education, they have a certificate as a journey person, in this case, manufacturing technician, I think. And they've had employment for this whole time. They had an income for this whole time. So that gives you an idea of the potential of this as a way to keep young people engaged and preventing them from dropping out. The slide that I kind of skipped here is this, applying this in California would look a bit like this. This is an education to employment model that it's described in more detail in the paper that I alluded to, that will give you a link at the end. You can download and take a look. The idea here is from left to right, from school to employment. The green is meant that you're showing that you're making some money. And what you'll see is the single path at the bottom is where we are currently. The upper half is a path that includes both academic coursework, grades 11 and 12, just as I said, in blue, and then those light green shaded areas, that would be where you split your time in high school, maybe for the last 2 years of high school, between work and between the workplace and between your academic training schools. and then you might go on for another year, maybe 2 years, depending on the complexity of the occupation that you're pursuing. And you could then still do advanced training. The idea is you can move back and forth between those two paths at will. So you may find after your training, and we found this often with young people who have gone through an apprenticeship, is that they find, you know, I actually want that degree. Now I understand why I want that degree, that advanced degree. I want to be an academic, and vice versa. You might find some practical experience leads you to realize, I want this apprenticeship. The idea here is you should be able to get there without incurring this enormous debt that young people are saddled with these days. So, on the employer side, what you would see in a full, in a sort of an ecosystem, is that you can search for apprentices the same way that you search for employees otherwise. You could say, you know, my company has, as I said, you know, we're 100 people. At any point, 15 to 20 of those are apprentices. Here are the skills that we're looking for. And there's a marketplace. This is an app that is in use in England, where this is how you find work. And this is how employers list their apprenticeship positions. Sort of an addition to the overall labor market. It requires this partnership between three main entities. This obviously has to be employer driven. There are no apprenticeship positions without employers offering them. These are not, this is not guesswork about what might be needed in the market 10 years from now. This is current needs from current actual employers. It requires a partnership with your K through 12 system, and it requires clearly some good partnerships with post-secondary educational institutions like community colleges and four-year institutions. And often it requires, especially in this transition period, some intermediary that helps navigate this partnership or these sets of partnerships. If we had it in California, again, the governor asked for 500,000 apprentices by 2029, 10 years from now. California actually could even handle more, but 500,000 is a good goal. It's obviously a very massive increase. Business would invest at a very high level in order to make this happen. They're already investing significantly to train workers. It's just that for young people, the access points are somewhat more difficult to find. And businesses would make money doing this. Young people would add, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 billion to the economy, and they would reduce their student debt by about the same amount. So it's a very dramatic impact on educational debt in this country or in the state. And youth unemployment, which in some places is still quite high, would drop as well if we had this, because you're actually employed when you are in an apprenticeship, and certainly post the apprenticeship you would be. So that gives you an idea of what the picture would be like. Why do we need this now? Well, we've needed it for some time. The reason it is particularly suitable at the moment is in high employment, low unemployment situations, being able to make this transition is more achievable because employers really are looking for talent. They're hurting for talent, and they're more willing to try new things to get at that talent. So I think in that sense, we are ready. And there is also willingness at all levels of government to look at new ways. So I think that's the other reason. And then thirdly, obviously, we're not in a sustainable situation where educational debt now is the second highest source of debt, and is saddling young people at a time when they actually shouldn't have to worry about paying off educational debt. And in some cases, you know, this debt stays with you all your life. They're 50 and 60-year-olds still paying off their student loans. That's clearly not sustainable. There's a whole set of recommendations as to how we get there. I'm not going to belabor that. This is not really the subject of this webinar. I'd rather get to questions, but suffice it to say, there's a quite a bit that is necessary for this to happen at a large scale. But on the smaller scale for pilots, this is not that hard to start, actually. And there are some pilots in place in different parts of the state. Some are in development. Obviously, there are pilots and more than pilots. There are whole system change efforts are underway in Colorado, for example, also in the state of Washington and elsewhere. So this is in development. Again, quite a few things need to happen. But if they're not underway already, they're certainly in planning stages. And as I mentioned, every year we're sending some people to Zurich to study this. There's a delegation headed out there in a few weeks, again, to work with teams from around the world to figure out what California can learn from other countries, other states. Colorado has been sending delegations there. State of Washington has as well. So with that, I think it's time for questions.
Thanks so much, Vince. This is so fascinating. This is actually, I think, the second time I've gotten to see at least some of these slides. And it's, as I've been going along, I'll give people a little bit of time to either type in questions into the chat or think about something that maybe they've been thinking about. And I wanted to just start in by asking a little bit of an overarching question, but one that's also maybe a little bit more at the grassroots level right now, which is, it sounds like the Trident Technical College model in South Carolina, which is pretty fascinating. They're able to start their program during high school, and it made me wonder if there's other models that actually start in high school that are happening in the U.S. or even in California. And part of the reason why I asked that is just because I know, modification and adaptation to a K-12 curriculum is a particularly challenging thing for any entity to make a change on that. And so it suggests that there really needs to be some strong K-12 backers in the room making that happen in the first place. And so I was, just to give folks an idea of, how people have negotiated those sorts of relationships of being able to jump into the classroom, be allowed to modify the curriculum so that youth can actually participate at high school and then continue afterwards. Are there other examples, or do you have any vision of what that is like to make that happen?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I think the two areas in which this generally is seen as challenging are how do we change the school day and the school week in order to make this a reality. That's one aspect. The other aspect, it tends to be on the employer side, is things like liability. Well, we don't have 17-year-olds on the shop floor. We really can't have that. And, is it even legal? And those kinds of things. So these are very important questions. The first one on the educational side, I think some of the CHI grantees are actually in the forefront. So Norco College is working on a youth apprenticeship with high schools in the neighborhood to actually do, both answer all these questions for their own program, but in doing so, they also ask the state questions and they ask all the partners some questions. What we found in going around the state and meeting with educators in the high schools, superintendents, principals, and so forth, is that where we thought that there would be resistance, and in the past, honestly, there had been resistance, there isn't that resistance now. So principals and superintendents say, hey, we can make this happen. We can change our school schedule. We are interested in this. We have been working on making our educational system more work-friendly or more workplace-oriented, but there's only so far we can go. This would be another important step in the right direction. So we can do those things. And then if you find, the assumption had been, and this has been true elsewhere in the US as well, in South Carolina and say in Colorado, for example, is that it starts out with some pilots, with Coalition of the Willing, with some partnerships, with some specialized schools. Sometimes these are the public charter schools, for example, that may say, we have a little extra flexibility. Let's test this out with us. School district may say, we're going to start it with one school and then expand it, so that they can figure out how does this work out. One thing that it does, and these are kind of important things for educators to obviously who pay attention to this stuff, is that it meets your CTE requirements if you do this, and it can meet your A through G requirements as well. And this is one way in which you have to kind of map out your strategy of how do you provide this so that your classroom activities and your work-based activities are matches in ways so that you meet all those requirements at the same time. What it does unlock is a desire to learn that is hard to match in other ways. So the intangibles are tremendous. The tangibles, making sure that you meet all those other requirements, can be managed. And then on the liability side, clearly, yes, it's legal. You can have minors in the workplace. That is a legal thing to do. And there are ways, and the foundation may want to weigh in on this. I assume there are people on the call, how you can manage the liability through having an employer of record during the training period, so that perhaps the liability question can be addressed, and the employer doesn't incur the full liability of having a young person in their workplace during the apprenticeship. So those are all things that can be mitigated, and they can really, and over time, I think they'll actually fade as concerns, but certainly in the transition period, they can be addressed.
That's great. And to kind of piggyback on that, and not to speak for anybody, because you can unmute yourself if you have a question and want to chime in as well. But Emiliano, who's here in Oakland, dropped into the chat. Also, how does doing this impact the teacher credentialing program, which is also a great question, another piece that kind of needs to get filled in potentially for a program like this. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I wonder if I understand the question correctly. Emiliano, are you wondering what it requires in terms of training teachers to be ready for this? And so there's another way of looking at the question. And again, maybe you can clarify for me, and that is, how could we get teachers to become apprentice? Could there be a teacher apprenticeship program? And there could be. In fact, one just launched not too long ago, and it was described as the first in the nation. I don't know. Sometimes these claims are not always true because we just don't know about everything else that goes on. But as far as training teachers, so the interesting thing is, in an apprenticeship situation, you need to train the workplace, the work-based, the masters that are teaching the young people the job skills. You need to train them as well. Not everyone who's very good at a craft is actually a good teacher of that craft. So they actually need some training. And that is typical of an apprenticeship program, that you actually train the teachers. In Colorado, they do 1, 2, 3, I think multi-day workshops. In Europe, they do this as well. They train. You are not just allowed to be a trainer in a shop just by the fact that you're there. You actually go through some training, meet some requirements, in order for you to actually understand, how do I actually impart this wisdom that I have to someone else. And some are obviously naturally born to do this very well, but still there are some ways in which you train them. On the teacher side, one of the interesting things is, it would actually allow you, and I mean, some school districts, Emiliano knows this well, from a career partnership academy setting, have been very good at working toward making their school system be very, very employment friendly, and sort of mimicking the workplace even in some cases. So teachers, again, would also benefit from additional training in how to work in that environment. But in some ways, educators can then focus back on the essentials. So if communication and math is what they should be focused on, well then, teachers are well trained and are expert in doing that. So they may actually have to be less focused on the workplace in this system. I'll stop there.
Vince, this is Joshua, and you brought up the foundation, and I appreciate that. We have been working on, through our Career Catalyst service, ways in which we can, for 20 years now, ways in which we can limit that liability, and especially, there's two issues, right? There's the workers' comp issue, and then there's also the sort of general liability issue. And so we've been working on that for some time, and as we're partnering on our kayak initiative around this to figure out ways in which we can deepen those supports. But it comes, you were mentioning certain programs that have made relationships with employers and become more employer friendly, and it just brought to mind some of the charter schools that are out there. So here in Sacramento, there's a school called the Met, and the Met is a charter school that actually integrates work-based learning into high school. And so these students have an internship that, and sometimes it's multiple internships with employers, but that last through their whole high school experience. And so they're actually working through paid work experience while they're involved in high school, and then they focus their curriculum through the lens in which, and their projects too. There's a project-based learning component to this. Through the lens of the sector that they're involved in, and it seems to me like that would be a really good place to start in terms of finding a coalition of the willing. Has there been any thought to that you know of?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I mean, I think this is exactly at the core of the work that is to be done. So, for example, and Josh brought up kayak. It's not the new water sport that we're involved in. It's the California Youth Apprenticeship Coalition. So it's a brand new sort of entity that you're welcome to join. And there's a link at the end where you can do that. And it's essentially this idea that we have a lot of interest in this state, actually. And we have a lot of work to do to make this come into a system and come into its own as a career education approach. So I think this is right in the heart of what the work would be. So these are all very, very good. So lots of thoughts about it, but it hasn't gelled into a system yet.
Great, thank you both. And I know that we're now actually 1 minute over on lunch, but I wanted to just give folks one quick last opportunity if anybody had any last just burning questions that they wanted to get out. Now's your chance. So if anything else comes to mind for folks, definitely feel free to drop us a line. You know how to get a hold of me. You can get a hold of anybody here on the technical assistance team, either at the foundation or at SPR. And Vince, yeah, you want to share a little information here on this last slide?
I just wanted to mention, we alluded to the California Youth Apprenticeship Consortium. There's a link there. You can sign up. The paper that I've referred to, and there's more information on some of the things I talked about the future of apprenticeship in California, is on this link. If you have more need to discuss this further, feel free to contact me or Josh or anyone at the foundation.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining this month's webinar. You should have an invite actually for June's webinar, which will be coming up shortly. You should see that in your inboxes within the next 48 hours or so. Thanks everybody for participating. Thank you, Vince, so much for sharing this pretty big picture and systems level thoughts and ideas. Super helpful, super interesting. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. It's a short one. Take care, everybody.